Hello, welcome back to Fred in the Shed, and something completely different on this video. I want you all to relax, get a cup of tea, get a cup of coffee, fill your vape tank, because I want to tell you a story. And to do that, you're going to have to cast your mind back and imagine the time of 1936 when CROSLEY released the greatest tube radio ever produced. It was called the WLW model Super Power radio receiver. Before I get too deep into the story, I'd like to give a shout out for the SWL listening post and Nuts and Volts, which is where I found my information. It turns out that the CROSLEY WLW Super Radio was born nothing out of other than competition with rival radio company Zenith, because in 1935 they produced a flagship radio called the Stratosphere 1000Z. This radio featured 25 tubes and 3 speakers, including 2 12-inch low-driven speakers and 1 6-inch high-frequency unit. It stood an impressive 50 inches tall and sold for $750, which was more than the price of an automobile back then. And I put that into an inflation calculator and it came out as $44,700 in today's money. Now, despite that incredibly high price, you'd think they wouldn't have sold any of these radios, but they actually ran the model for 4 years, and 350 sets found homes. Looking back almost 90 years later, it's hard to imagine what this set must have been like. I mean, certainly here in the UK, we've never really had the same benefits of choice that you get in America, but most people here were listening to a very, very standard set, probably with about 5 tubes, and many people couldn't really afford that. They would have to rent that weekly from places like Rumbelows, so a lot of people were building their own crystal sets, and my grandfather, I know, was running a 300-foot wire down his garden and through his neighbour's garden to hear foreign radio stations. At the time, the president of CROSLEY, Powell CROSLEY Jr., couldn't be anything but impressed by this Zenith radio, but he went on record to say that it only had 25 tubes and just 3 speakers. This was the era of massive shortwave broadcast radio stations, and CROSLEY Jr. owned a 500,000 watts, 500,000 watt powerhouse radio station called WLW. And he was inspired to surpass Zenith by bringing to the world the largest and most powerful radio receiver ever yet produced. And it was with that idea that CROSLEY went to his engineers that very winter, pretty much with an open checkbook, and he told them to design him a radio with no fewer than 30 vacuum tubes. It had to incorporate 6 loud speakers, 4 separate chassis, and must produce the highest possible sound quality with the deepest richness of tone. What I find amazing about that is that this radio was going to be produced as a very expensive commercial product. It wasn't just a one-off showpiece. I just think it's amazing that he had the power to go to his engineers and to give them such a blank sheet of paper to produce something original like this radio. And in fact, his engineers were reported to be very, very happy having this freedom of budget and to be able to choose the very, very best components. And I just can't really imagine any company today doing that in 2024. Also, this radio had to be produced in rather a short time, but when completed, the engineers surpassed even CROSLEY's expectations because the finished item had no less than 37 vacuum tubes. It incorporated 6 separate speakers and had 75 watts of power. Now, I know that doesn't sound very much in today's hi-fi, but you have to think about the way vacuum tubes work, and they generally are very much low power. I mean, typically in the day, a 5-tube All-American 5 radio would probably struggle to produce 1 watt of power, and this colossal radio had 75 watts. Its wooden cabinet used 7 different types of wood and stood an impressive 58 inches tall, 42 inches wide and 22 inches deep. When it came down to build quality, well, no stone was left unturned. Even the inner workings of the radio that wouldn't normally be seen, they were all chromium plated. Tubes and speaker mounts were finished in gloss black, and each of the 4 separate chassis had its own serial number mounted on its own plaque. When it came down to audio performance and components, everything was made to the highest possible standard that was available on the day. There were 4 separate chassis. There was a variable radio frequency pre-selected amplifier, a intermediate amplifier, and then finally an audio amplifier, and also a separate power supply with its own chassis. The radio ran 3 completely separate audio channels handling the low, mid and higher frequencies. These were assisted by a triple tuned transformer, with the engineers running free with an open checkbook. Every feature that could be included was actually included. There was an automatic volume control, an automatic frequency control to prevent drifts, and an automatic volume expansion feature to compensate variations in the volume of music being broadcast from the receiving station. In accordance to CROSLEY's wishes, there were 6 speakers fitted in the cabinet. There were 3 high-range tweeters, 2 12-inch mid-range drivers, and 1 huge 18-inch low driver, I suppose equivalent of today's subwoofer. The speakers were set that they focused in 3 different directions, a bit like spatial surround sound. Now, you have to mention the 18-inch speaker because this was so heavy it weighed 85 pounds alone, and this meant that when the radio was delivered, it was shipped without the speakers fitted. These had to be fitted separately when it arrived at the person's home. The total weight of the radio was an incredible 475 pounds. Another feature worth mentioning was the public address system. Connected to the radio by a 25-foot cord was a 4-inch crystal mic. Fitted to the radio was a 2-way switch, which gave the option to completely cut the music and use the radio as a PA system, or to allow blending, a bit like an early version of a karaoke machine where you can sing along to the radio. It is said that the radio had sufficient audio power to address a crowd of up to 10,000 people. One thing worth noting in its absence is a turntable. There was an input on the amplifier that you could connect your own turntable, but at the time, although discs had been around since about 1898, and in the 1930s the 78 RPM disc was well established, but at the time they just didn't consider that the shellac resin discs could produce a good enough audio quality that would be compatible with the high fidelity sound of this radio. And it was almost by chance in the Second World War, really, when the shellac became hard to come by, that they started pressing discs on vinyl, and then instantly the records sounded better. The radio's tuner had a tuning range from 540 to 18,300 kilohertz, and at the time that covered all of the commercial broadcast band on shortwave. The amateur radio band, the shipping band, and also the police bands. The overall design was very modern for the 1930s, and there's some nice touches on the radio, a bit like the grill cloth for the speaker. It has the classic CROSLEY WLW flame design. Also, the radio featured a magic eye tuning tube, but in this case it was in the shape of the firm's logo, which was a lightning bolt, and this glowed as you tuned into a station. Equally attractive was the eye-catching 12-inch aeroplane style screen printed glass tuning dial. This was mounted at chest level on the front of the radio. Below the dial were 5 control knobs. There were 2 separate volume controls. The first one controlled the low and mid-range, and the second one was for the higher treble frequencies. There were 2 tuning knobs. This effectively split the radio into 2 different bands. And then finally there was something called a fidelity control, and this is really interesting because this offered you 5 preset audio filters, a bit like the preset graphics you get on modern hi-fis, and this went on to feature on future CROSLEY radios, but was eventually dropped because it was considered too confusing for the average radio listener. Personally, I find that a little bit patronising, because on this radio, in the middle of the tuning dial was a mechanical indicator which clearly showed you which filter you were using. I just wonder if this was a little bit too advanced for the time and too difficult to mass produce. Finally, if that wasn't enough knobs to twiddle with, set in the left side of the cabinet were 3 separate tone controls, 1 for bass, 1 for middle, and 1 for treble. The radio was finished and launched in time for Christmas on the 25th of November 1936 under its full name as the CROSLEY WLW model Super Power Radio Receiver. That's quite a name, but the press had their own name for it. They called it the COLOSSUS radio. The sale price of the radio, a colossal $1,536 US dollars. I ran that through an inflation calculator and that came out at $88,800. Now in 1936 here in the UK, an average worker was earning between £2 and £2.50 a week. One interesting fact was that there was no official record kept by CROSLEY how many Colossus radios they did build, let alone sold to the general public. I mean, the first thing is obviously you'd have to be super rich to be able to afford this, and I guess you would want your purchase to be confidential. It is known that a model of the radios were fitted out in the flagship showrooms, and one sales director did have one at home that he liked to show off at parties. A few radios still exist in museums, although I don't think they're working models. And there was one radio which was supposedly restored, did appear on eBay a little while ago, and that was offered for sale at $160,000. And as you can guess, that did not sell. On a final note, I just find it amazing really that something like this was built purely out of rivalry for a competitor, which was Zenith Radios, of course. Now, Zenith was founded as Chicago Radio Labs back in 1918, and they filed for bankruptcy in 1999 and were bought out by LG Electronics. As far as CROSLEY itself, well, that was founded as CROSLEY Corporation in 1921, and it soldiered on to 1956, where it went into receivership. Although that's not really the end of the story, because the CROSLEY name was resurrected in 1992. But sadly, this was just a name only, and no resemblance to the once proud company. In fact, they went on to produce some god-awful plastic portable turntables and some really terrible looking retro hi-fi units. In fairness, I suppose they did do a reproduction of their last product, which was a 1956 tube radio, and more recently they've tried to branch out into some better quality turntables, but unfortunately nothing like the glory days. And that's it. That's the end of the video. Something completely different on Fred in the Shed. I found this story interesting, and I hope you did also. If you get a second before you pop off, if you could just hit me a thumbs up down below, and I'll know you've enjoyed the video and I've done a good job. But as always, please look after each other, stay safe, and of course I'll catch you on the next one, guys. Cheers.